first and foremost, the state has a responsibility, if it's going to pretend to be tough on crime, stop just putting up pictures of people being pushed out of boats in the Channel and start actually dealing with the rapists on our streets.
Jess, it's impossible for us to talk about safeguarding against women, without mentioning that just this week, a man was given a 5-year sentence for sending you death threats. He was actually already in prison for sending threats before to Rosie Duffield and Theresa May, which really underscores that this wasn't about politics. This was, in my opinion, about misogyny. What do you think?
I mean, if you were to read those death threats, which unfortunately I had to, there would be no doubt in your mind that it was about misogyny. Mm-hmm. This is a man who the letters are basically like your children are going to be killed, like they will go immediately to the sort of things, and also the constant harking back to the killing of Joe Cox, mm-hmm. which this man in one of his letters claimed he had arranged for his friend to do. But this isn't unusual. The vast majority of the death threats and violence that I suffer mm-hmm. is linked either in one way or another with my work around domestic abuse. So right. that the vast majority comes from people who perceive somehow that I have had their children removed from
right.
them.
Right.
Because I campaign against the sort of abuses in the family courts. Mm-hmm. And so, or it is just simply like, shut up, bitch. Mm-hmm. Any woman with a voice is somebody who has to be taken down. And it very much, the abuse against women in public life very much follows the same patterns mm-hmm. as in whatever the reason or the motivation for that violence against women in public life. And we see it all over the place at the moment. It follows very much the same pattern as that of classic domestic abuse. So first of all, they will neg you, talk about the way you look, make you feel like you don't have a voice, that maybe you should step back just by the negativity. Then they will isolate you. They will try and start attacking people who talk to you. So if anybody ever interacts with me on social media, they'll be like, Jesus, I've had a day because I said hello to Jess Phillips. Right. I'm like, please don't talk to me on social media for your own benefit. So people will stop talking to you and start to be like, oh, I don't want that in my life. And then when that doesn't work and I keep on speaking, the only place to go then is violence. Right. So then you start to get the very, very violent and aggressive threats.
Because what I've certainly noticed as a newspaper columnist is when I write about something or another female columnist writes about a subject, we will get so much abuse. And when a male columnist does it, they don't get anything. And do you experience that as well?
Yes, so male colleagues of mine, there are exceptions of male colleagues who suffer, and obviously we're in the wake of the death of a male member of parliament.
Yeah, which I was going to get.
The male colleagues, David Lammy is one of the big exceptions, and I imagine, I don't chat with him much, but I imagine Rishi Sunak suffers from some of this as well. Mm-hmm. People of colour will get it in a certain extent, but even David Lammy, if he were here, would say it's nothing compared to that is suffered by my female colleagues.
Yep, sure. And I was going to mention, obviously, the terribly tragic death of David Amos. So we're not saying that men in the public eye are immune from aggression and violence, but in your experience as an MP, do you think that women are more subjected to randomly spewed aggression, like the kind of death threats you were getting this week?
I mean, yeah, there is 2 or 3. I genuinely forget how many people are currently in prison for trying to harm me. Like the case that you're talking about, they emailed me to say he's been sentenced for 10 years, and I was like, I didn't even remember that was the day, because there are so many cases, there are people who are sectioned, there are so many cases running all at the same time that you genuinely start to forget about them. Whether that's a protective thing, I should imagine some of that is true, but also just the volume of it and the headspace of taking that level of hate in. But there's none of my male colleagues would say that was the same. It's undoubtedly an element of violence against women and girls that extends, because it is in our society, extends into our politics.
So let's talk about your work in domestic violence, because as well as being the MP for Birmingham Yardley, you are the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence. And before that, you worked at Women's Aid, before you went into politics. So you are all too aware of what domestic abuse does to women and children, and the problem, as we know, has only got worse during lockdown. Now, if you were in government, what would you be doing to stop this?
Well, the very first thing I'd do is make it matter. It simply doesn't matter. Very much like policy around social care, which there's been much debate about recently, and equally childcare, is that we expect so much free labour to be done by women to put in the gaps, to fill in the gaps of where the state fails. So we don't look after old people in this country, or disabled people, or disabled children. We expect women to do it, and because they continue to do it, and sometimes I wish they'd just go on strike, but they're not willing to put their disabled children out the front of the door, unsurprisingly, because we give our labour away so freely, because that's the expectation of us, that the government just says, oh, well, that's not a gap that we need to fill, and domestic abuse is exactly the same as that. All violence against women and girls is exactly the same. There is a government expectation, and this isn't just this government, although they're considerably worse. Don't get me started this week on how shit they are. But what a day I've had. But later on, you know, a place like this, I'm expecting people to pay me loads of money to ask questions for them. Apparently that's the standard in UK politics now, and then I'll just get my friends to change the rules. I'm obviously not going to do that.
You can ask me to do that, though. I'm willing to be paid for questions.
Brown envelopes to Hadley. So the trouble is that the government currently expects women to just take it, and that has often been the case. So the problem with domestic abuse in this country is the volume of it. So the volume is so great as a crime type. It is the violence against women and girls is the greatest violent crime type in this country, and every politician, certainly every prime minister, stands in front of its people and says the first responsibility of any government is the safety and security of its people. And what they're saying when they close their eyes and think about that, they're thinking of men in uniforms managing borders, and they're thinking of bombs from the sky or threats from a terrorist, and they're like, I will protect my people. And never once has any one of those people ever thought about me or the women in our country and the safety and security risk that we face on the streets, in our homes, or at work. And until when they say that statement, they think of our security and the things that we experience on a day-in-day level, until that is the government priority. So the best example I can give you of this is the comparison with diabetes. So diabetes care in this country, we have a National Health Service, God love it, and don't we just love to clap for it? Everybody in this country who has diabetes would have, unlike America and places like that, you know, everybody would have access to insulin. In this country, the volume of people with diabetes wouldn't come close to the volume of people who've been victims of violence against women and girls. So, but it is a volume issue. And currently what we say to people who are victims of domestic abuse is 10% of you can have insulin. We'll give insulin to 10% of you. And the other 90% of you, you have to literally be near to death before we're going to give you a shot. You have to be in a hypo shot, and then we're going to give you, not necessarily the insulin, maybe a slightly shitter version, but we're going to then, at that point, when your risk is so increased, because the 90% of women just do that labour for the government. They stay silent, they stop coming forward, they take it themselves, they look after it themselves, they look after each other,
and look after
their children and try and protect them. But we ration services on the basis of risk, and no woman in this country is entitled to a service until she is at imminent risk of death. And even, as the statistics will tell you, most of those women cross the threshold and that imminent risk of death becomes a very real reality. And the data, the 2 women a week data, it belies the women who die by suicide, the women who die of terrible substance misuse issues, the sudden death, die on the streets, that die in prison. All of that is linked to violence against women and girls and the trauma that has been suffered. It costs the government every year £66 billion in cost, and we don't put anywhere near that money in. And so the thing that has to happen is it has to be a priority, even just for crime agencies, let alone housing, welfare, the health service, all of that, we're not even close to being right on that. So the government department that leads on it is the criminal justice bit. Tough on crime, my arse, friend to the rapist is what I would describe. The current government is less than 1% of cases will ever receive conviction, less than 2% will ever receive a charge of rape. Rape is a crime. You're going to get away with 100% tough on crime, my arse. There's no tough on crime when we're talking about sexual crime. Not at all. Every police force in the country was recently asked to identify their 5 most serious harmful offenders as part of an inspection report. And these are men who have abused again and again different women. Minimum 2, I think in the report the maximum was one person had abused 13 different women. And of the 40 men that they identified in this category, 34 of them were not being monitored or managed by any agency. Now imagine a terrorist lives in your community, has already committed harm, is plotting further harm. Do you think that it would be acceptable to say, oh, we're just not going to monitor them? It'd probably be all right, wouldn't it? It'd probably be all right. And that is because we expect the women to do the free labour, to manage our safety. We're expected to manage our own safety. Don't walk there, don't go out at night, make sure you check your drink. It's not my job anymore, it's not women's job anymore to do the labour that should be, if it should be done by anyone, it should be being done by men. But first and foremost, the state has a responsibility, if it's going to pretend to be tough on crime, stop just putting up pictures of people being pushed out of boats in the Channel and start actually dealing with the rapists on our streets.
Now, we've had a lot of coverage recently of the case of Penelope Jackson, the woman who killed her husband. And of course, the reason this is getting so much coverage is because it's so rare. And it's absolutely tragic that David Jackson was murdered, but it's frustrating that the 2-point-something wives, girlfriends who get murdered every week, don't get the same attention. It's also incredible that Penelope Jackson got an 18-year sentence.
Unbelievable.
When Anthony Williams, who killed his wife of 44 years last year, Ruth, got 5 years.
5 years.
Can you explain that discrepancy?
I mean, the discrepancy is the patriarchy in a justice system made by men to suit men and fit the reality is I didn't design this system. That's the fundamental of it. But when women commit crimes, regardless of the mitigation, and everybody, in my view, I'm not a hang 'em and flog 'em, although I've definitely, as I got older, I've got a 16-year-old son who the other day lectured me on capitalism for some 30 minutes and how it had ruined fun, and then requested that I took him to the Odeon. So I definitely feel myself getting more conservative with a small c, hang 'em and flog 'em as I get older. But I believe in a restorative system. I believe in a justice system, which we currently don't have in this country, that seeks to rehabilitate. But the idea of a woman who commits a murder is still, and it's not even just murder, if you take it down to every single layer of crime. I used to run a female offenders centre as part of my work at Women's Aid, and you would frequently see women being imprisoned for things like stealing baby wipes, or their children, the children who had moved into refuge accommodation, not attending school, and their mothers being criminalised for them not going to school. So at the very lowest end of criminality, their fathers weren't never criminalised for beating the shit out of their mothers, but their mothers are being criminalised for the petty crime and acquisitive crime that they commit. There is a fundamental, and people don't believe this. People believe that men are treated more unjustly by the justice system. And the family court system is a really good example of this, where the average punter on the street, thanks to some twat who dressed up as Spider-Man 20 years ago, think that that mothers have it easier in the family court. Whew, not true. Domestic abusers have it easy in the family court. I've almost never handled a case of the very most violent men who were refused access to their children. Almost never. So the reality is that our justice system penalises women still as if they're responsible for their victimhood. And where a man falls victim to a crime at the hands of a woman, that's a proper victim. Whereas a woman's victimhood is somehow, the mitigation is always somehow her responsibility. And so when you see a crime, and also we just don't value women's lives, the idea that somebody snaps and murders somebody is very, very common in the reasons why men get manslaughter charges rather than murder charges. And it's just bullshit. People don't snap. That is part of a long running, and in this country there is no premeditation of domestic abuse. That won't be considered premeditation. Even if you'd been abusing somebody for decades, that wouldn't be considered premeditation. Premeditation is taking a weapon to a place. So you get more in this country currently. If you were to take a knife, if a young kid takes a knife out to a park, is involved in some fracas in the park and stabs somebody, as bad as that is, that the minimum sentence for that, because they have taken a weapon, is 15 years. The minimum sentence if you kill someone in the home with a weapon is 10 years. Don't tell me that that's because we don't value women's lives. The biggest rates of knife crime in this country are against victims of domestic abuse.
Now, people talk about the killing of David Jackson, which is very tragic, but the reasons domestic violence is disproportionately inflicted on women, and women suffer more, is because of the physical differences between men and women. There are more, obviously men are stronger. Now, it's become rather difficult to talk about differences between men and women's bodies recently, and this lay behind the reluctance of Keir Starmer saying at the Labour conference to talk about this, and he told Andrew Marr on TV last month that it's not right to say only women have a cervix. Now, it's impossible to talk about domestic violence without discussing these discrepancies. But do you agree with him? What do we do about this?
Look, I mean, I don't necessarily think that only women have a cervix, because trans men would have a cervix. Well, some of them might. I've only got half of one. I find that degrading my experience of a woman by Andrew Marr, I have to say, I bumped into him just afterwards and I said, would you like to talk about my perineum or my areolae as well? Knock yourself out. I find that the debate being degraded, a difficult debate that needs to be had, and part of the main problem with this debate is that the sort of closure of it. The closure of any ideas is dangerous, very, very dangerous, and it leads to horrible shouting. Not just shouting, violent, aggressive people leaving their jobs, like awful. So do I think it's transphobic for somebody to assert that only women have a cervix? Not particularly. I think it's the biology. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that many of, and I can only speak from personal, actually that's not true, I can speak from years and years of experiencing other people's personal experiences. Women suffer discrimination on the basis of their biological sex. There is no doubt about the fact that I have periods, pregnancies, tits, that I have suffered discriminations, been paid less, been kicked out of a job. My biology does matter. A woman shouted at me coming out of the Labour Party conference. She was shouting at me something about Rosie Duffield, I think it was. She was like, do you stand with Rosie Duffield, who's a colleague of mine, who has a very particular...
well, she didn't come to the conference because she said she didn't feel safe.
She did actually come in the end, though.
She did appear. She made a secret appearance.
She said, do you stand with her? And I was like, at first I was like, literally I stand next to her all the time. It's not like a metaphorical thing. She stands by me all the time. We drink tea together in the tea room. But I was like, of course she should be able to come here. No one should ever feel that the environment is so hostile that she shouldn't be able to come here. And then I just said, I'm sorry, I'd just come out of a thing talking about dead women. And she said, how do you know they were women? Did you check if they had cervixes? As if in my work I've ever checked if somebody had a cervix when they asserted that they were a woman to me, whether dead or alive. And the idea that you can crystallise this down to phrases, it's a bit Trumpian, trans women are women, or women have cervixes, it's just to belie the actual importance of a debate about biological discrimination and LGBT discrimination. Both of them deserve to be out in the air and discussed openly. And that's the sad thing about it, is just simply not possible.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about the violence attacks, and we now saw the incidents this week with Kathleen Stock, who's an academic at Sussex, who felt that she had to quit her job at Sussex because she talks about the biological reality of women. And we've also, you and I have both seen, I've certainly experienced, maybe you have too, of men generally shouting at us on social media about this subject. Do you see these attacks?
Men shout at me on social media about everything. You name it, fisheries. Sometimes if I put up a thing about like what breakfast I've had, somehow this is an insult to, I don't know, Palestine. I'm like, it's really just a breakfast.
But do you see these attacks on women talking about the biological reality of their lives as a new form of misogyny?
Oh, it's 100%. And I think that what we've got to be very careful in the feminist movement of, and don't believe that the feminist movement has always got on with each other.
No.
I mean, I went to Women's Liberation Playgroup, because, that's how groomed I am to feminism. And it was set up by a group of women in the late 1970s and early 1980s because there was no formalised childcare. And so there was a cooperative set up where each woman would do a day, and so that the women could go out to work. I don't know where the men were. Why weren't they doing a day? But anyway, it was a bygone era. My mum used to say to me, who's one of these women who'd set this up, so the only problem with feminism is the feminists. She'd say the same about socialism. The only bloody problem with with socialism is the goddamn socialists, like yada, yada, yada. We don't all see eye to eye on different things. What worries me about the fracturing of the feminist movement at the moment, and it feels visceral, but then all politics feels more visceral than maybe it has before. There seems so much opportunities for dividing lines rather than uniting lines, and some of that abuse that you're talking about, though, that largely does still come from men, it presents to me still as misogyny. Shut up, bitch is the same, regardless of whether you're saying it with a little hammer and sickle on your thing, or with a British bulldog on your thing, or with a rainbow flag on your thing. Shut up, bitch sounds the same to me. We've got to make sure that we are looking at the things that unite us and working through those and agreeing on some differences, because we will make no progress if we don't agree on... every day, I don't like, I could sit here and slag off the Tories all day long. I mean, there isn't enough time in the day for me to sit here, especially after this week. I still have to work with them, and I will dance with the devil to make women and children safer. And so I have to find the things that unite me with the people who have the power to change something. And if you can't do that, you have no business in a movement, because your movement is just a row. It's not moving forward. Yeah.
Now, I think we probably only have time for one or two questions I want to ask about the Labour Party in particular, a Labour Party on women. So it's very easy for us to look at the Tories and think that they're sexist pigs, with Boris and his endless unaccounted for children all over the country. But they have a better record of supporting women. They've had 2 women leaders.
They have.
And whereas Labour has had 2 female MPs saying they're too scared to come to Labour Party conferences. It was Luciana Berger and Rosie Duffield for respectively their fight against anti-Semitism and for women's rights. And presumably they didn't feel very supported by their leaders. So does Labour have a women's problem?
I think every political party has a women's problem. I think every part of society has a women's problem, is the absolute truth of it. The Labour Party, without question, as an organisation, is one where women can organise together to improve and change things in a way that maybe doesn't always exist in other political parties. But does it mean ultimate power for those women, or the women in the country it seeks to serve? The Labour Party doesn't exist for the sake of the Labour Party, although sometimes it feels like it does. Like any organisation, you sort of have a love-hate relationship with them. But I think that there is an issue around women's leadership in the Labour Party, without question. The Labour Party has 51% representation of female MPs. It has positive discrimination in order to make sure that women... I wouldn't have been elected if it wasn't for the positive discrimination, to make sure that women candidates are elected into winnable seats. So, but those things that I'm describing, the good things, were all organised by women in the Labour Party, working together as part of collective action and seeking power together. They weren't handed to us freely. Harriet Harman once said to me it took her an 8-year campaign to get the hairdressers to do women's hair in the Commons, and that I have maybe got to learn a bit more patience. I'm not very patient. The truth is that with the leadership question, for a woman to lead the Labour Party that then led the country, when you are a Labour woman, you are not just a woman who is a politician. It is a radical act to be a Labour woman politician. You have to wish to dismantle the system as it currently exists, the powerful systems that currently exist. And for still quite a lot of people in the Labour Party, that system is the system they know and feel comfortable with. And so Labour women are not women who are just going to do the bidding of powerful men and not upset the status quo. So Theresa May, regardless of the T-shirt saying, I'm a feminist, or whatever it was she wrote, and Margaret Thatcher, they were not there to fundamentally undermine the status quo of male power in society. But that is exactly what a Labour woman leading the Labour Party, that is our DNA, whether it feels like it all the time or not. And maybe I shouldn't speak for all my sisters, and that's much harder to let through the door, even for people within the Labour Party. Yeah, I think it's much harder for Labour women. We're held to a much higher threshold. We're held to a much higher standard, not just against men, but against other women in politics. I have to be perfect. I have to be absolutely pitch perfect. I have to be right about everything. I have to be good and kind about everything, whereas other people can get away because people expect more of Labour women. You're meant to be better than that. And sometimes that's pretty tiring because sometimes I'm really shit and I can't be arsed.
Well, even Dominic Cummings says that Labour needs a woman leader. So Dominic Cummings understands it, even if Labour doesn't. But thank you very much, Jess Phillips.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.